Hi Internet, my name is Katie Turner and this is Learning to Learn. Alright guys, so the time has come. I finally get to start getting into anatomy and physiology. So I started my first real module of content last night. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I do when I'm learning new content. And so my focus today is really going to be on note-taking. So I'm going to show you a little bit of insight into how I do note-taking. And I don't follow any like particular strategy, but I definitely learned a lot growing up from teachers who taught me different things, and it's sort of this conglomeration of a lot of things. I do some of the things I learned with Cornell notes, but it's not strict Cornell notes. I do shorthand. I do a lot of things that you might think are a little weird, but they work for me. Let's talk about how I take notes. So first of all, I am not fancy about my materials. I like a good old-fashioned cheap notebook from Staples and a Bic pen. Those are actually some of my favorite tools to use. I like having some highlighters in hand nearby. I like having colorful pens nearby in case I want to differentiate something in my notes or label something or draw something. So I do keep a little basket back here of my materials that I use a lot. So it's got all my pens, it's got highlighters, it's got colored pencils, all kinds of stuff. Those are the things that I'm using, but it's nothing that you need to break the bank over. I might do a video where I talk about what I use and the aesthetic, but I'm definitely not one of those people on YouTube that has the beautiful study space that is super bougie and has all these great materials and colorful materials and it's so photogenic. I just do my thing. Okay, so sorry, that's not something that I really have right now. First, let me talk a little bit about my shorthand that I use. I started this in 9th grade. I had a teacher, shout out to Mr. Driscoll, who had us do Cornell notes of our textbook like every night, and it was a real pain in the butt, but he required that we use shorthand, and if we didn't, then we would get points off of our grade. And I remember thinking, oh, this is such a burden. But after I started doing it, it really made my note-taking more efficient. So have you ever been in a class and the instructor is talking so fast and moving so quickly that you are just barely keeping up and you're in that panic mode?
Why aren't you all copying this down?
Yeah, we've all been there. When you get into college, you're not gonna have a professor every time that is gonna stop every 10 seconds and say, oh yes, let me wait on you, right? You have to keep up with them. And it's just more efficient. So what I started doing, without really thinking about it, it wasn't intentional. I just started writing and shortening all my words. And one of the things I did was I left out the vowels of words. And there's actually, like, scientifically in neuroscience and psychology, your brain does fill in those gaps. And so it actually works pretty well. If you've ever seen those memes where it's like, if you can read this, blah, 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 and it's your brain filling in the gaps, that's something that your brain does for you, so why not take advantage of it? So I started leaving out vowels in a lot of my words. Now it doesn't work perfectly because some words are mostly vowels and, you know, or some words look the same if you leave vowels out, so you have to get creative with that. But usually the context helps me to know what word it's supposed to be. And I remember Mr. Driscoll saying, that's one way to do it. So that works for me. I use other abbreviations that I kind of created through that as well. So instead of writing and, I put a plus, obviously, or I might use, if there's a word like reformation, has the word form in it, and for, I would put a for, and then I would just put MTN for mation. So formation is an example of how I might use shorthand. Or the sound in, like and, or into, or, you know, I use symbols, I use lots of different abbreviations to make my note-taking a little bit more efficient. Now, this is something that is important to understand. You're the only one that has to read your notes. So it doesn't matter if someone else doesn't understand them, as long as you can understand them. Now be careful, because you still want to be able to understand them a week later if you go back to them. You don't want to look at it and be wondering, what was I writing? What does this mean? So be careful of doing things that are so out of the box that then you go back and you don't remember. But for me, it made sense for my brain. That's how I use shorthand. Another thing that I try to do when I'm taking notes is I try to outline my notes in a way that makes sense to me. I use hierarchy. This is a way of organizing information in your mind, organizing concepts that helps your brain to remember it better. So I'll use all different kinds of bullet points, and I'll indent and I'll make it into sort of an outline so that I can tell what goes where, and okay, here's this section that is all about this topic, and then now we've started a new topic. It helps me as I'm learning the information, and it also helps me as I'm reviewing later. Sometimes it gets a little dicey if the instructor introduces something and then they talk about something else and then they come back to it and I don't have space in my notes. But for me, I don't panic. I'll either just add it in the area if I can in the margin, or I'll just start another section and put the same title so that when I go back, I know they're connected. Now, this brings me to one thing that I didn't talk about, which is why I don't use my iPad Pro to take notes and why I like old school notebooks. So there is some research that suggests that writing is helpful, more helpful to your memory, and physical writing on paper is better than, say, typing on a computer. I know that on the iPad Pro, I have my Apple Pencil and I can write on it, but it's just not the same. I agree with this YouTuber Study Quill about how I prefer actual writing to the iPad Pro. And I do use that a lot for my planning, for teaching and things like that, or I'll use it for notes in professional development. But for something like a class, I always just love the old school pen and paper. Now let me talk about something that I see as a huge trend on YouTube and StudyTube, as you would call it. I love beautiful notes. I love looking at them. The aesthetic is so great. It just is so satisfying to see beautifully crafted notes with the highlighting and the lettering and the brush pens and all of that. I'm learning calligraphy. I like doing that. However, my notes don't look like that. My notes are pretty basic and they are sometimes messy. I don't waste time with whiteout. I don't waste time with making it color coded or beautiful. And notice that I'm saying waste time. And this is not knocking on anyone who has gorgeous notes. That's great. If I had the time, I would do that. But most of us don't have time for that. We don't have time to spend hours redoing our notes, or during a lesson we don't have time to make a header and make it beautiful and then keep up with the instructor. We just got to get the information down. So that is my advice to you, is don't waste your time making them beautiful. If you have the time and you want to go back and do that, by all means do what you want to do. It is very nice to have nice looking notes, but as long as you can understand your notes and you can find the information, you don't need to go crazy with highlighters or brush pens or anything else. So I do occasionally stop and I'll draw something in my notes if there's a diagram I want to remember, or I might highlight a section if I'm like, oh, I wrote this out and I can't find the terms I need, so I'm going to highlight the terms real quick so that it's more convenient later on and more efficient later on for me to find that information again. That's the only time I would really stop and do that kind of thing. And this does bring me to something that I love to use in my notes, which is visuals. So one way that you can help your brain to memorize information is to organize that information. We've already talked about hierarchy, using hierarchies in the way that you outline and use your notes and the way you set up your notes. But also including visuals like charts. I used in my notes on this module, I made a pyramid of a hierarchy. I also drew a diagram to sort of help myself visualize the different planes in the body, how we divide the body up by planes. So trying to remember the sagittal and the coronal plane and the, transverse plane. So all of that, it's helpful for me to visualize it. One of the most important things you can do to help your memory as you're learning new content and as you're studying it is to connect it to things you already know. So there are a couple ways you can do this. One way is by just writing a little note to yourself of something that you already know really well that connects to that concept in some way. So for example, in the beginning of my notes today, I noticed that the module was talking about structure and function and how important they are within understanding anatomy and physiology. And so I know in psychology that there are two perspectives, early perspectives of psychology, called structuralism and functionalism. And they are both aiming at understanding human behavior, and it's similar in anatomy and physiology. So I put a little note, like in psych, so that way I can remember, oh yeah, okay, that's a very similar idea. You can also do this retroactively after you've done notes and you're going into a study session. You can, if you're creating, say, note cards or going back through your notes and you're reviewing what you learned, you might make those connections later. It may not have come up in the moment, or you might have to think a little bit harder and try to come up with a way to connect it. One of my favorite ways to have my students connect what they're learning to something they already know or are already familiar with is to find connections to things they are interested in or to themselves personally. It doesn't always work perfectly because, for example, standard deviation is not a term that I connect personally with very often. So that's a little bit harder, but I might apply it to the AP Psychology test results. I can tie it to that, and that already has a personal connection to me because I'm invested in AP Psychology test results. Another great effortful processing tool and memorization tool that you can use is Mnemonics. You've heard of Mnemonics, you've used them since you were a kid probably, and I always think of Mnemonics as sort of like those acronyms that, you use the first letter, but beyond that, you can also create other types of mnemonics. So one of my favorite kinds of mnemonics, sounds cheesy, but is using hand motions. So I do this in my class all the time, and I was actually doing this without even thinking about it last night when I was learning about the different planes that we use to divide the body and sort of identify where things are. I was trying to visualize it, and I started doing things like this, and it really helped me. So I was, for example, thinking of the sagittal plane, which divides the body into left and right, and then the coronal plane, which is front and back. And for me, I remember that. Like, I didn't review that just now. I just remembered that because I was using different parts of my brain. And that's part of what I like about hand motion mnemonics is that I'm saying it, so I'm using my temporal lobe, which controls my auditory processing, using my parietal lobe, because I'm using hand motions and my body movements. I just noticed that I was just using hand motions that I taught my AP Psych kids about the different parts of the brain. So there you go, it works. Another really important thing that you can do while you're learning new material especially, but also when you're reviewing, is ask questions. I love when my students ask questions. I think students are scared to ask questions because they feel like the teacher is going to get annoyed. But if you're asking a relevant question and a clarifying question, I love that as a teacher, and it's so helpful to my students. So it does a couple of things. One, it helps you because it might show your teacher that you're not understanding what they said, and then you can get clarification. Two, it also helps your classmates because your classmates are going to benefit from hearing your question and then hearing the answer to the question. And three, it benefits your teacher because now your teacher knows where you are in your understanding and they're better able to teach you. Now, I am studying online by myself, so this is a little bit harder, but what I did, and if you're studying at home and you come across the question and you maybe can't get a hold of your teacher right away, is hello Google, right? If you know how to use Google well, you can search for an answer to your question and clarify some things. So last night when I was studying, I got to some of the terms that I really struggled with were proximal and distal. I was not understanding from the short video that was in the module. I wasn't really getting the point of it or the difference or how to really define those things. I had a very vague understanding. So I went to Google and I looked up proximal versus distal, and then I read a few articles on it or a few links, and then I was able to better understand it and get a better idea. Last thing I did at the end of the study session was I went back and made a list of the things I wanted to specifically work on memorizing in my study session tonight. So I'm gonna go through that list tonight and come up with ways that I plan to memorize those things. I also went back and marked some of the problem areas that I was having that I knew I might struggle with. That way, when I'm studying, I can focus my energy on those topics more than others. All right, guys, and that is it for my first full-on content study session. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you back next time. Bye.